There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in places where men once worked with their hands. I noticed it the moment I stepped off the bus in Crestfield, Pennsylvania. The air was cold, not the clean cold of winter mornings, but something damper, something that settled into your coat and stayed there like a memory that refuses to leave. This was the silence of something that had stopped breathing. I stood on the sidewalk and listened. Somewhere far off, a truck engine rumbled and faded. A street lamp above me flickered once, twice, then held steady, casting a pale yellow circle on the cracked pavement. I had not been back to this town in 47 years. The last time I walked these streets I was 23 years old, still carrying coal dust in the creases of my palms, still believing that hard work was the only currency that mattered in America. Now I was 81, and I had come back for a funeral, not for a man, for a town. The letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The Harmon Mining Corporation was holding a community gratitude ceremony to mark the permanent closure of the Crestfield coal mine, the same mine where my father had worked for 31 years, the same mine where I had spent 2 years of my youth before escaping to the Army and eventually to Hollywood. They were celebrating, they said, celebrating the transition. I read the letter twice, then I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. Something in me, something old and stubborn, said I needed to be there, not to make a scene, just to see, and maybe, though I did not admit it to myself at the time, to make peace with the guilt I had carried for decades, the guilt of leaving, the guilt of never coming back. The ceremony was held in the old Miners' Union Hall on Birch Street. I remembered this building. I remembered the dances we used to have here on Saturday nights, the wooden floors groaning under heavy boots, the smell of tobacco and cheap beer. I remembered my father standing by the window with a glass in his hand, the evening light catching the gray in his hair, laughing at something one of his friends had said. I never asked him what the joke was. I wish I had. Now the building had been renovated. The old wooden floors were gone, replaced by something synthetic and gleaming. The walls had been painted a shade of blue that reminded me of hospital corridors. The air smelled of fresh paint and industrial cleaner, as if someone had tried to scrub away 50 years of history in a single weekend. And there were banners, everywhere, banners. Thank you, Crestfield, honoring our heritage. A new dawn for coal country. The fabric rippled slightly in the draft from an overhead vent. I stood at the back of the room and watched. There were perhaps 200 people in attendance, mostly older folks, men and women my age, faces carved by decades of hard living, of early mornings and long shifts, of raising children on modest wages. Some sat with their hands folded in their laps, knuckles white. Some stared at the floor, some looked at the stage with expressions between resignation and quiet fury. And then there were the others, the corporate people. They stood near the front, clustered around a podium decorated with the Harmon Mining logo. Young, most of them, dressed in suits that probably cost more than a miner's monthly paycheck. They smiled constantly, those practiced smiles that never quite reach the eyes. The CEO was a man named Theodore Whitmore III, Harvard Business School, third-generation wealth. Never worked a day underground in his life. His hands were smooth and pale. I noticed them when he adjusted his cufflinks, hands that had never known the weight of a pickaxe. "Friends," he began, "we are gathered here today to honor the incredible legacy of Crestfield Coal Mine and the generations of hard-working Americans who built this community." I watched the faces in the crowd. Some nodded, some stared blankly, some tightened their jaws in that way men do when they are holding back words they should not say. A woman in the third row pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Her shoulders trembled once, then stilled. "Change is never easy," Whitmore continued. "But I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that Harmon Mining will always be grateful for everything you have given us." Grateful. The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. I thought about what grateful meant to a company like Harmon Mining, walking away from a town they had stripped bare. Pension cuts announced in footnotes. Environmental damage that would take generations to repair. 2,000 people losing their livelihoods. So shareholders could see a better quarterly report. A woman near me, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "They're thanking us for letting them steal from us." Her husband shushed her. His hand found hers and squeezed, but I heard her, and I agreed. Whitmore talked for another 20 minutes. He talked about community investment funds and transition assistance programs. He used words like synergy and stakeholder engagement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a faint, persistent hum that seemed to burrow into my skull. He never once mentioned the 12 men who had died in the 1987 collapse. He never once mentioned the black lung claims that Harmon Mining had fought in court for decades. He never once mentioned the creek behind my childhood home, Willow Creek, that had turned orange from acid mine drainage and never recovered. He talked about legacy, but not the real one. When he finished, there was applause, polite applause, the kind that comes from people who have been beaten down so long they have forgotten how to fight. I did not clap. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets, wondering if I had any right to judge. After all, I had left. I had escaped. What right did I have to stand here now after 47 years of absence and feel superior to these people who had stayed? I found myself thinking about my father, Walter Bronson, born in Lithuania, came to America with nothing, worked the mines for 3 decades, never complained. He used to say something to me when I was young. A man's word is his foundation. Everything else is just weather. I understood what he meant now. These corporate people, they had words, polished words, words that sounded good in press releases, but their words had no foundation. They were just weather. I asked myself if I should say something. I was old. I was tired. My knees ached from the bus ride. There was a tremor in my left hand that had started a few years ago and never quite gone away. I had spent 50 years in an industry just as full of pretense as this ceremony. Hollywood taught me that most battles are not worth fighting, that silence sometimes is the wisest choice. And there was something else, a question I did not want to ask. Had I become like them? Had 50 years of cameras and scripts turned me into the same kind of performer I now despised? I thought about the roles I had played, the tough guys, the men of few words, the heroes who always knew what was right. But those were characters, and I was just an old man standing in the back of a room, wondering if I still had anything real left to say. My father had taught me something else. When a man lies to your face and smiles while doing it, you have 2 choices. You can smile back and become part of the lie, or you can tell the truth and accept what comes. I had smiled back many times in my life, too many times. There were moments I should have spoken and didn't. Contracts I should have refused, people I should have defended. I carried those silences with me still. Maybe that was why I had come back to Crestfield, not to make a scene, just to stop smiling, just this once. After Whitmore's speech, there was a reception. Cheese cubes on plastic trays, their edges sweating under the lights, wine in plastic cups, a string quartet playing something forgettable in the corner. I watched a young woman in a gray suit approach one of the older miners, a man I vaguely recognized. His face was weathered, his shoulders stooped. "It must be so hard," she said, "seeing everything change like this." The miner nodded slowly. 52 years my family worked this mine. My grandfather, my father, me. My son was supposed to be next. "That's incredible," the young woman said. "What a beautiful legacy." Beautiful legacy. I felt something tighten in my chest. The miner's son had been one of the 12 who died in '87. I remembered reading about it years later. A structural failure, inadequate safety inspections. The company had settled out of court. I had meant to write a letter, to send something. I never did. Another silence I carried. I did not plan to speak. I walked toward the back of the room, intending to leave quietly. The exit sign glowed red above the door. 10 more steps and I would be gone. But then Theodore Whitmore III appeared in front of me. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Ted Whitmore." I looked at his hand. Smooth, manicured, a gold watch gleaming at the wrist. "Charles Bronson," I said. His eyes widened. "The actor?" "The same." "Well, this is an honor," he said. "I had no idea you had connections to Crestfield. What brings you here?" I looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. "My father worked in your mine for 31 years, I said. "Really? That's incredible. You're practically part of the Harmon family." "No," I said quietly, "I'm not." He blinked. "I'm sorry. I'm not part of your family, Mr. Whitmore. I'm part of this town. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression. The professional smile remained, but there was a wariness behind it now. "Of course. I didn't mean to imply. You talked a lot tonight," I said, "about legacy, about gratitude, about honoring the people who built this community." "Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what. But you never mentioned the 12 men who died in 1987. Silence. The string quartet kept playing, but it felt very far away. You never mentioned the pension cuts, the health claims your company fought for decades, the creek that runs orange behind my childhood home." Whitmore's smile was frozen now. "Mr. Bronson, I understand there's complicated history here, and I assure you—" "You assured everyone tonight," I said. "That's all you did, assurances." "But assurances aren't the same as accountability, are they?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I continued. "You know what my father used to say? He said a man's word is his foundation. Everything else is just weather." I looked around the room at the banners, at the plastic cups, at the fluorescent lights humming their soulless song. "This," I said, "is weather. I did not raise my voice, I did not make a scene. I simply told the truth. And then I turned and walked away. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something else. The weight of finally saying what I meant. I was almost at the door when I felt a hand on my arm. Light, tentative. I turned. It was an old man, 85, maybe 90, stooped and thin, leaning on a wooden cane worn smooth by decades of use. His face was weathered, deep lines carved around his eyes like the grain of ancient wood. He looked at me with pale blue eyes. "Walter's boy," he said. His voice was thin, barely above a whisper, but steady. I stared at him. "I knew your father," he continued. "Worked beside him for 18 years. Best man I ever knew underground. My name is Henry Kowalski. I was there the day you left for the army. Your father was so proud, told everyone his son was going to see the world. Something caught in my throat. He talked about you all the time," Henry said, "even after you became famous. He never bragged. That wasn't his way. But he kept a scrapbook. Every newspaper article, every movie review. He showed it to me once near the end." I had not known about the scrapbook. My father had never mentioned it. Not in his letters. Not in our phone calls. Not in the 3 visits I managed to make in the last decade of his life. Visits that were always too short. 3 visits in 10 years. I felt the shame of it now, hearing about my father's pride from a man I had never met. "He said something to me," Henry continued. "A few days before he passed, he said, 'My boy knows how to stand up without standing out.' That's the hardest thing for a man to learn. Stand up without standing out." I thought about what I had just said to Whitmore. I thought about my father's quiet strength. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be tough, trying to be the man the cameras wanted me to be, and I wondered if I had ever really understood what my father meant, until now. "Thank you," I said to Henry Kowalski. My voice came out rough. "Thank you," he said, "for saying what needed to be said. Your father would have been proud." I glanced back at the room. Whitmore was still standing where I had left him. An assistant was at his side, speaking rapidly into his ear, and the townspeople, the miners and their families, were watching, not cheering, not applauding, just watching, with something in their eyes that looked almost like recognition, almost like hope. I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The cold wrapped around me immediately. That damp Pennsylvania cold I had almost forgotten. It felt honest. It felt real. The sun had set. The sky was deep blue, fading to black. A few stars were beginning to appear. I walked down Birch Street toward the center of town. My footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk. The storefronts were mostly dark. Half of them were empty, abandoned businesses with dusty windows. A hardware store with a yellowed FOR lease sign. A diner with a cracked neon sign. A barber shop where my father used to get his hair cut every other Saturday. All gone now. I stopped at the corner of Birch and Main. There used to be a statue here. A bronze figure of a miner holding a pickaxe dedicated to the men who built Crestfield. It was still there, but someone had draped a black cloth over it. The fabric moved slightly in the night breeze. I stood and looked at it for a long time. People sometimes ask me what I learned from all those years in Hollywood. They expect me to talk about fame, about fortune. But the most important thing I learned before I ever left Pennsylvania. I learned it from my father. I learned it from the miners who went underground every morning, knowing they might not come back up. I learned it from men like Henry Kowalski, who spent their lives doing work that no one celebrated. The lesson was simple. Humility is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And the truth, even when spoken quietly, has a weight that lies can never match. I thought about Theodore Whitmore III. I did not hate him. I did not even blame him entirely. He was a product of his world, just as I was a product of mine. Maybe he would think about what I said tonight. Probably not. But that was not the point. The point was not to change him. The point was to refuse to become like him. Not to win, just to witness. I walked back to the bus station. I sat down on a wooden bench outside, the same bench where I had sat 47 years ago, waiting for the bus to basic training. The wood was worn smooth now, polished by decades of waiting. I looked up at the stars, the same stars my father had looked at, on nights when he was too tired to sleep. A young woman approached the bench, 25 maybe, wearing jeans and a worn jacket with a frayed collar. She had the look of someone who had grown up here, that mix of toughness and wariness that comes from living in a place slowly dying. Her eyes were sharp, though, alert. "You're him, aren't you?" she said. "The movie star." "I used to be," I said. She sat down beside me. "I heard what you said in there. To that Whitmore guy? My grandfather worked in the mine," she continued. "My dad, too, until his lungs gave out." She looked at the empty street. "Everyone's always sorry, but no one ever does anything." She looked at me. "Why did you come back?" I thought about the guilt I had carried for 47 years, the letters I never wrote, the scrapbook I never knew existed. "Because I needed to remember," I said finally. Who I was before I became who I am. She was quiet for a moment. Did you find it? I looked at the stars again. I don't know, maybe I just found out that some things don't need to be found. They just need to be honored. The bus arrived. Its headlights cut through the darkness. I stood up and extended my hand. What's your name? Sarah, she said. Sarah Kowalski. I smiled. Henry's granddaughter? Her eyes widened. You know my grandfather? I met him tonight. He told me something my father once said. Something I needed to hear. She shook my hand. Maybe that's why you came back, she said. Not to find something, just to hear it. I boarded the bus. Through the window I watched Crestfield disappear into the darkness. The old buildings, the empty storefronts, the statue of the miner draped in black. Let them all do what they do. I had done what I came to do. Not to change the world, just to stand in it, just to witness, just to say, quietly, that some things are not forgotten. The bus rolled on through the night. I closed my eyes and thought about my father, about the scrapbook I never knew he kept, about the pride he never expressed to me directly, about the words he spoke to Henry Kowalski. My boy knows how to stand up without standing out. I was not sure I had ever truly lived up to those words, but tonight maybe I had come a little closer. Standing up is not about being seen, it is about being true. Outside the window, the hills of Pennsylvania rose and fell in the darkness. Coal country, forgotten country. My country. I did not know if anything I said tonight would matter. Probably not. But I knew this. The truth does not need to win. It just needs to be spoken. And once spoken, it has a life of its own. It moves through the world quietly, like water finding its way through stone. Sarah Kowalski had asked me if I found what I was looking for. I told her I did not know. But now, sitting alone on a bus rolling through the Pennsylvania night, I thought maybe I did know. I had come back to remember who my father was, to remember who I was before the cameras and the fame, to remember that humility and dignity are not the same as silence and surrender, and to remind myself one last time that the truth is worth speaking, even when no one is listening, even when nothing changes, even when you are just an old man on a bus, heading home through the darkness. The stars burned on above me, the hills rolled past, and somewhere behind me, in a town that was slowly dying, a few people were still awake, still remembering, still standing, just quietly, just humanly, and that was enough. The bus driver announced the next stop. I did not look up. I just sat there, eyes closed, letting the rumble of the road carry me forward, thinking about coal dust and starlight, thinking about fathers and sons, thinking about the words we say and the words we leave unspoken. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats I heard my father's voice, not the words, just the tone, calm, steady, true,